Hello everyone, today we talk about some scattered aspects of medieval military morality, a difficult but crucial dimension to research. Naturally, the Clausewitzian adage that war is a clash between moral forces that reciprocally influence one another is particularly relevant in as much as, the study of combat is concerned, because von Clausewitz describes a purely military dimension, even when he describes the instrumentality, let's say, of the latter in relation to politics. He does not expand on anything that is beyond the art of war. And it's not a limit, as a matter of fact. Actually, it's a very important reminder that there are intertwined but conceptually separated dimensions that are relevant to study. Today, we look mostly, obviously, at all three, let's say, the persons of the wonderful Trinity, the Clausewitzian Trinity, that is actually a very overlapping but the same historical or Christian Catholic Trinity, as a matter of fact. Before anyone says, but von Clausewitz was Prussian Protestant, we know what Catholic means, of course, and I even made a video explaining how sort of the Indo-European Trinity overlaps with the Clausewitzian concepts, and it couldn't be otherwise. Because, after all, looking at medieval warfare must be an exercise not just of strictly military analysis, but indeed also of political and social background, as any other, say, military theme. Drives, actions, aspirations. These are all very complicated topics to enucleate or at least to substantiate whenever we are trying to browse a medieval mentality. Its psychology, what these people actually believed. On Schwerpunkt, we have carried the thing somewhere in as much as we studied especially history of religion, tradition, and so we come to unveil a bit, in some cases, the obvious regarding certain beliefs that we cannot quite measure in an experimental way, even at that point simply quantify, but that the contemporary world seemed to have somehow removed from historical analysis, not much because of the aforementioned neurocognitive limits, but quite importantly for the almost denial or forgetfulness about the quite evident, the quite documented types of beliefs that people held at the time, and that we can definitely make a history of in a positive heuristic sense. The 12th century, much has been said about this one, so much so that courage would have been an innovation of the same. These are the words of Georges Duby regarding the Sunday of Bouvines, which is a classic medieval warfare. Naturally, those ideas, we will not be talking about Duby's background, we don't have the time, but I have been preparing also videos on medieval historiography as a whole. At some point we will really thoroughly get a bit into the limits, but also the useful aspects of these last centuries, this post-traditional world, because it's paradoxically through these ideas that we can somehow reveal part, even to the mistakes made by the same, of such mentality, right? The courage was definitely not an innovation of the 12th century, but it is true that we get to hear more of it, we get to read more of that from the sources. The overarching explanation is quite simple, especially from the third quarter of the 12th century, we have an enucleation from a written, a literary point of view of certain concepts that we come to call chivalry, right? You know that we talk a lot about this topic. On Schwerpunkt, there's a playlist dedicated to medieval knighthood, also to medieval literature. And, for example, most of the latter also revolves around the literary canons of chivalry. Why did this happen? Well, because the, Western Frankish, but from that, expansive center, like Western feudalism at large, was starting to put some limits to the participation to knighthood per se, right? Knighthood up in the previous centuries and up to the very origins of the concept, actually very much in the millennium before Christ, had been a somehow simpler business. There was a level of initiation that brought to the acquisition of certain psychophysical capacities, all in between, mixed with military experience, social background, and that sort of qualified the miles, war de cingulum militaris, that was dubbed by an extent. From the later 12th century, the higher nobility separates further because of the skyrocketing growth of their power in the expansion of broader medieval civilization from the rest of the aristocracy, and confers, especially to knighthood, a sense of sort of category that is accompanied by very specific ceremonials that become ever more expansive, that sort of socio-culturally separate from the rest of many other warriors that were, by the way, some would have had forms of dubbing, etc., and would have been knights also in their own regard, but others that, think about the Servientes, etc., that came to fight at some point, especially throughout the 13th century, in the same identical way as their leaders, their masters, were somehow considered, in fact, of a lower rank. We're not going to discuss this today, but what happened? It happened that, as unfortunately structuralistic historiography has habituated people to think like, at some point, these scholars began to think, not necessarily to explicitate or to actually believe, but to argument on the pattern that since, say, in the 12th century we see this exploit, for example, of chivalric literature, chanting the same high nobility that would just describe, to valorize it, to sort of enucleate it ever more in a courtly milieu, that the higher in those higher spheres, etc. That and remember, this was largely a materialistic sort of mentality, like in those years, especially the French school was quite influenced by this primarily social interest, in opposition to some kind of more moral ideal, religious side of the story. And so the notion would have been that this chivalric literature was just chanting things that had, not just that didn't quite exist at the time, but that in this sense, given the relative silence in the previous millennia, is really not the case, because it's actually plenty of documents witnessing to knighthood, to chivalry from much older eras, but not so, say, modernly and secularly explicitated, right, by sources that we can start sort of feel as much closer to us by different indicators in our national languages, modern sort of tongue, would have been sort of an innovation, would have been created to establish a myth. In part, this intuition is correct exclusively to the degree that the late 12th century was paradoxically, compared to the previous times, a more modern secular time than it had been before. And so actually far from creating courage as a concept that had never been sung, it actually starts to sing it because there is some sort of coming less to that. There is some idea that, for example, the higher nobility actually still fights like hell, like it's something that would continue doing for a long time, but was now more sort of involved into higher business. It's a bit like the same concept of the king that cannot be simply wasted or spent on the battlefield because he has governmental sort of statal responsibilities, so to say. So we start seeing something like that. The later 12th century is a moment of great expansion of literature in general. We start seeing a lot of these things. Think about Chrétien de Troyes that we described, but there is the Sicilian school of poetry. We start getting really a lot of the older, for example, Celto-Germanic epos, of the myth of the soul of chivalry, that were, or again, as we have studied in the traditional religious videos, concepts that really everybody knew from millennia, and that at this point had been just slightly forgotten and sort of modernized and secularized presented in ways that, in fact, even the moderns haven't quite fully understood as being so deep and profound, right? What were all these poets like Dante, like Petrarch, talking about this angel-like woman, right? Of course, there is a deep, so everybody can understand immediately, even just through the female inspiration, why that model existed. But this was literally the soul of chivalry, the core of the imperial Ghibelline ideal of the knightly sort of military traditions of the war bands, of the brotherhoods, of holy warriors that still existed during the Crusades at this point in the age, in fact, of the militias and so on. It's something that we have begun to forget, bringing, in fact, such big names like Duby to provocatively, not literally like believing that courage, just as it had started to being sung in this particular way, courage, mostly in the langue d'oil sense, as it would echo in later literature in many ways, to a new, partly also a new emphasis, was actually not a new thing, and it contained a sort of much deeper sap to it all. All right. By the way, La Dimanche de Bouvines is a great book. I also just recently made a video about the deployment of the armies of Bouvines that can sort of widen the interest towards this kind of topic just per se. But we know very well that there is a deep connection between poetry and warfare. To think about the ideal of the skald, but also like the warrior poet, really, the notion that indeed the peak of male creativity is also the peak of male crime. And if you read the Minnesänger, if you read the Still novel, you really realize in European tradition how much people that really butchered other human beings without much of a problem had a traumatically refined poetical sensitivity and artistical talent. This is absolutely normal, and it also, in fact, provides us with some of the greatest masterpieces of Western civilization, exactly from the Middle Ages. And by the 12th century, we know how, for example, minstrels were instrumental in the courts in spreading these heroic tales and glorifying warriors. In part, this was singers of somebody else that were, say, noblemen, actually, proving themselves in this, as we just said, in this exercise. And we definitely start understanding more, especially the sort of literary side of the story, because most of this had previously been sung only, right, and not necessarily written down. And so we can grasp so much from the prior tradition, especially through this. I made recently some videos about Chrétien de Troyes that from Évêque de Nid, for example, that are quite evocative, as explicative, as a matter of fact, regarding this prior military ethos. But we have different examples of this. For example, during his campaigns against Soissons, that is a rival figure in Scandinavian warfare, King Valdemar, a Danish monarch, essentially it's Valdemar I, reigning between 1157 and 1182, employed a bard whose songs denounced his foes' parricidal betrayal and called for retribution. Right. This is important because you understand how there is not just a mere artistic purpose. There is properly an imbuing, a motivating, a fidelizing, like a faithful motive in these kind of songs. The songs had to be true. They had to tell a real history, and they had to motivate the warrior to claim justice as well. Skalds, bards at some point were the depositories of the same juridical knowledge. And when you look at these clashes that are still, we can imagine 12th century Denmark in all its brutality and primitivity, but still like elucidate pretty well the importance of these statements. All right, and the actually imperial character the same, because you had, especially in as much as these were tales of olden times, of great kings and fighters, etc., they had the specific function also when learned by heart by the same warriors to constitute a military baggage, like a morally motivating, inspiriting wisdom that had to highlight how and why people would fight and die, and what was the ultimate reward, and how to achieve it, obviously. So obviously a way that to literature that is hardly ever taught, I can assure you, in even some of the most advanced literary history faculties that mostly point to the style, to the generic context, but that do not have much grasp of the religious or the military purpose for which these works actually existed. They weren't looking at literature in the way we do now. It was almost an accident that this stuff was actually written down, and we have actually lots of examples in previous civilizations. It's a bit like the Roman sagas written down in the time of Livy. All right, there is a process of civilization, and also at this point in the 12th century, as we said before, the writing down of the Celto-Germanic epos that was around from really a very long time. Think about the migration era itself. We're talking more than half of a millennium. In a skirmish against the residents of Châtillon, a region in Burgundy often embroiled in medieval disputes, a band of Burgundian raiders, emboldened by their youthful vigor and strength, was preceded by a jester who, with his instrument, recited ancestral wars and grand deeds to inspire imitation. All right, it's as if this voice was just a vessel of the Holy Ghost. Imagine, for example, the symbolism, the iconography of victory herself, which is the Holy Ghost and the soul of chivalry, as preceding. Very often we see it in antiquity and later too, as the transfigured soul of the same victorious warrior, preceding him in the advance. And we hardly hear that speaking or singing, but actually in that older experience, it was likely, in fact, pronouncing these words that were considered like a bit like a cosmic law. Right? We know from Indo-Europeistics that the very languages that we speak, phonetically speaking, corresponded to very specific, to literally to celestial, to the noise that the celestial bodies made in their movement, and so were literally the voice of God that had to represent divine order in the fallen world. This stuff would have really been very mainstreamly understood at the time, right? Even if, again, in this point, like it was not like 1,000 years before, in full acknowledgement of this, there was a commixtion of sort of, again, more modern and secular ideas. The way these guys that very hardly also leave us something from their own side of the story, quite explicitly written, but that would have to be understood, in fact, through these very songs, would have really been aware of in the way they would use this music itself. Weiss, a 12th century Norman poet and chronicler renowned for his historical verse, recounts that Taillefer, a legendary Norman jongleur and warrior, performed La Chanson de Roland at the very Battle of Hastings in 1066, opening the way through such poetry to the pivotal Norman conquest of England. This is beautiful to think when you watch the video I made about the Battle of Hastings, mostly the life and times of Hastings, reflect on that, because we're really looking at a very sort of fringe world. Like you have the Anglo-Danish, there is this almost like Norse Viking vibe to it all. From the other side, you have the Normans that paradoxically have become, instead, the voice of greater imperial papal power. They're waging a crusade against their foes. They have the most advanced military. They are truly Western Frankish in essence, right? And the fact that they themselves, let's not even talk about the Anglo-Danish, about which we know less, but in this sense would have been less modern and secular, would have exalted the ranks of the Norman and Flemish and Breton troops by singing the famous Chanson de Roland. And so a Carolingian epos, if anything, that, as you know very well, also highlights the self-sacrifice in holy combat, the soul of chivalry. The Durendal is the same Holy Ghost / Victoria / soul of Roland that he loves more than his actual human woman that is crying for his death at home. And so it's something big, and it's something that would have really exalted the fantasy, the excitement, the bloodthirst of the Normans in battle. And again, the Anglo-Danish would have had definitely their own, just like, I don't know, the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge would have had their own stuff as well, etc. Right? Think about Tacitus' Germanic Carmina, right? These scenes of the Germans collecting their fallen, singing these verses literally in the Latin Carmina in the forest, right? And what kind of meaning would after the battle this would have really had? There is a lot about this, and if anything, at some point I will make a video about le jongleur in French, which are some sort of lower ranking carrier again of this epos, but that again still quite directly reflects what the knights themselves would have sung. Right, again, this stuff starts getting written, so also these attendants can start practicing it in a more technical way. For a knight, just like writing was not considered a particularly virile activity, also because these people spent their entire life on horseback in tournaments, licking their wounds also in the bad season, just thinking to reboot right during the spring. And I made an interesting video about got in fact lots of views about the 12th century knightly combat psychology, where that there is a beautiful hymn to war and its utmost wonder right in the minds of these fighters. Courage, we started the video with this notion, whether as a fervent passion or some sort of idealized conduct, especially in order to discipline or just to motivate, in this case, the younger knights, that also required, yes, courage, but courage, as von Clausewitz himself teaches, as probably the most noble of spirits, is also the cheapest in warfare, meaning that humans at large can all be courageous. Also what reenactment, I think, really it's one of the few things for which I believe that activity is actually useful, really shows that every single idiot can be thrown against into the fray without any understanding what the hell is going on. Winning requires a bit of other qualities, and that so courage is like the vanilla level of, say, whether you can get yourself killed or not. Then in order to win, you might, even by getting yourself killed, you have to do something else. But courage definitely leaves abundant traces in written records. Of course, courage can be raised to some kind of higher ideals, in the sense that courage here is not much just a matter of guts, right? It's mostly like, who is the best, like who is the most courageous, who is able to pull off the greatest feat and still stand on his horse at the end of battle. And so that everybody can see that this is very important, because as we've seen in battles in the era like the one of Arsuf, a great challenge to commanders like the famous Richard Lionheart was not just of course, like the broader complexity of tactical management, but very often like the coordination with the same friendlies, right? The fact that barons at this point, still largely so kings as some sort of prima inter pares, and this is before the Magna Carta, from the English side, by the way, as you know, medieval, I'd say, national monarchies were in theory at this point, were just structuring towards a sort of more apical hierarchy. And so the most important thing was having the charisma, the authority, and the inspiring discipline, say, necessary for everybody to have an adequate collective training where you couldn't or wouldn't surpass the other knights in the battle line, which would endanger the stability of the same, especially during cavalry charges. Everybody had to be perfectly aligned, etc. So we're talking some very interesting and provocative ideas here, because it's evident that in battle, the more courageous you are, and as we just explained, the higher the risk you're involved in. And so there must be some logic and reason behind that too, which is also what makes the difference in control through, cold blood, coup d'oeil, etc. As for who is the best fighter and the best commander, because at the end of the day, the knights we're looking at were, as you know, at the head of a retinue. They were lords, commanders in their own regard. So everything acquires a more corporative and hierarchical meaning. Stereotypes and linguistic conventions took shape, some enduring across the medieval period. That's why, again, 12th century literature is so primitively important, seminal, to also for the later authors, as tradition was gradually being forgotten, but at least there was some sort of fixed text to hinge on at this point. So if you make a meticulous study of the lexicon, you can look at the subtle changes, innovations, and abandonments distinguishing eras, regions, social settings, and literary forms. This is as straightforward as it gets. If you really want to understand the spirit of a people, look at their literature. Right? There are countries that are much more advanced, others that express much more sort of primal meanings, others that refer to some social context, others to others. So everything is the direct reflection of it. This is very important also from a historical, methodological point of view. There is nothing, let's say, you can always, naturally with the due care, with the due capacity, carry out a comparative analysis without necessarily needing a specifically explicit information that sort of formally confirms what you're talking about. And what does it confirm anyway? It's just something written for that matter. But you cannot simply separate literature from warfare or politics from society. Everything is etched like in this body. And the more I study history, and you know that I have a very specifically diachronic and comparative approach to military history, not only. And the more I realize that nothing is ever out of place, that of all the exceptions of the, just you would think from a mathematical point of view, all the random departitions from the main channel, what you find at some point, in fact, may be incredibly jarring or in the opposite direction. Everything historically matches the era. Right, of course, you must be able to critically interpret that. You can't. Many people just. I can't forget really those people who said, like imagine like I make a 2 hours and a half long video about, I don't know, the topic in which I specialize as a PhD in medieval warfare, to hear someone saying, but please add, this is good, but please add, some explicit quote from different literary sources so that this adds sort of, an hour of historical validity to yeah, because, it's not like me having an opinion. It's something that I studied for decades that actually matters. It's, letting simpletons think that since I, read from a straight source openly like that is going to be the historical quality of the world. There are entire channels that are based on this, right? Entire history channels like things like, it will not make any names, but you kind of know some of them because the title is even styled after that. Simply reading a source without even commenting on it or criticizing it, whatever. Look, this is actually medieval authors, like, because the average person does not even know that all these sources are public and everybody can read them without even buying any book or whatever. So it's really embarrassing, and unfortunately, that's also where most people really stop to. An exploration of the chanson de geste. These ones I also discussed in a video in particular. Think, for example, of the chanson de geste as translatio imperi, right? And propose this as an academic concept. Write a doctoral thesis on this topic, for example, because nobody has ever done it. But it's in there, right? In many ways, I explain in that video how essentially the values that are expressed in these chansons that naturally also express some sort of broader legacy, thinking about the chanson de Roland, etc. For the Franks, for the French and their sort of emanations, could be in terms of imperium holding. What kind of values these equated to, and to what kind of heights this mirrored basically the condition of what was frankly perceived, in fact, literally frankly, as an imperial authority, right? Then, of course, there are chronicles, instructional texts, warrior biographies, eulogies, and epitaphs, revealing in all their different way. Today, we don't have time to simply enter in this interesting comparison, for example, but they altogether reveal that courage was primarily seen as a noble aristocratic trait rooted in bloodline, heritage, and lineage. In other words, it was a racial attribute. This is extremely important, right? As physis does entail body and soul. I just recently made a video about the Cathars who were literally denying this, and unsurprisingly, paranoidly fearing the same might of the French monarchy in this regard for a reason. Like we see here, theology returns. What kind of sort of how can anyone deny that this is an actual pattern, and this is so obvious to point out, right? Because people fear this, right? Literally, I've gotten people from that video say, how can you say, that these people were actually like today's communists just because they were communists? Yeah, exactly. And again, we have reached that point. I think it's a neurocognitive impediment. It's not really a matter of historical method. It's literally phobia towards authority. This is a thing. Like the Fourth Estate cannot afford to accept that history itself is a matter of authority, not a mechanical citation that also does not get straight back to the truth. At any point, there is always some individual interpretation, and that's also what people fail to realize. There is no such thing as a point to stand on except yourself, all right? And that's where you get measured for who you are, by the way. As we said before, courage was much more sort of polysemic, had a much deeper semantic. It really illustrated not merely the exposure to threat, the willing exposure to threat by decision in combat, etc. It simply mirrored a higher moral status, right? Owned through like blood, through the deeds of the ancestors, those who had not succumbed to the guilt, they had not succumbed to fear, and therefore could make it out of danger intact, exactly because they had won the divine glory in the process. And this gene was literally carried through the dynasties, as much as they had not gone extinguished by spilling their blood onto some random battlefield. So this was an obvious as it was deeply seen as a process of military selection, right, of military racial selection, especially from this incredibly self-aware and sort of physical higher nobility and their knightly essence. So courage, of course, manifested in individual acts driven by ambition as well, which was connected with all the possible rewards that were primarily to be understood in a metaphysical sense. The craving for worldly riches was just sort of the instantiation, the material reflection of such power. But it was mostly a quest for honor, glory, and lasting renown after death, not as a mere memory, but in the traditional doctrine of the afterlife, of the victory over the so-called second death, the earning of the place in the firmament, and as such the capacity to keep on interfering into the world, right, from a higher, superior condition, another worldly one that would also confer ever more prestige to the still existing soma of the clan on Earth itself. I made multiple videos explaining the topic, and in the History of Religion playlist you can check that out. The hero was expected to shun the disgrace that cowardice, sloth, and fearfulness would cast upon oneself and one's kin. In the case, such this virtue had not been displayed. It was vital to show ardent zeal and strength in battle, amassing valiant deeds and noble feats, martial exploit, acts of prowess, and assault. The reputation of the warrior went in parallel with the notion that his fame was as extended as his actual capacity, and so that there was a value of merit, of quality and quantity in, for example, the military curriculum of this individual. Right? It would be extremely interesting to make a video about the actual importance of, let's say, literally leaving, as I was saying before, like an entire earthly journey, essentially as a knight, as a warrior. We know of people in the 13th century that had that still participated to tournaments at 80 years old, and it really also makes you wonder about what kind of human types these were, because the sheer violence, danger, and even just physical forces involved in mounted combat were something incredibly crushing, and so these people were truly a breed on their own. And it's really shocking to realize how this was especially normal for them. I mean, just imagine that this is psychophysically normal for people habituated to live like a normal 21st century life in the world in general. You can't even say, I don't know, it's a better, the more advanced or the lesser developed parts of the world. This is literally the type of lifestyle that is barely met by the peak of professionalism of a medieval knight in the 12th and the 13th century. Something astonishing in an anthropological but also biological sense. Such actions, of course, marked one as valiant, daring, bold, courageous, and proud, acting in the fashion of vassals with chivalric grace. There was a higher sense of hierarchy, of authority, of discipline, of rank. So none of these individuals was really out there in a vacuum, right? There were some moments in his life, such as during knightly initiation, namely the errant part of their life, where indeed they were traveling in faraway, obscure places in order to get the chevrons that would have allowed them to step up into a higher level of glory, politically, militarily, and socially. However, this system was quite tightly connected with, in fact, the entire system, the entire community, feudal monarchies in particular, and the entire world that is the one of crusades. So there is really no geographical boundary much of sort. It is first and foremost understood as a metaphysical journey, as all the traditional essence, right? This really takes place in the perennial world, or at least in the quest for it, which is also what the entire Grail legend is about, and what all the esoteric symbolism of the great, in fact, chivalric literature of the time actually means, according to, again, a millennia-old tradition. Less valued, though not outright condemned, were combatants who displayed arrogance, insolence, or were felonious, meaning cruel, merciless, or fierce. This is the case because, of course, there is always the path where the fire of death blazes, right? Tradition leaves a place, a liminal space between life and death, where actually which is a bit like the life of chivalry, if you think about that, where the hero has to be fully tested. And we know from that in fact there is not simply a positive path to chivalry. Like, you don't simply get into it as a simple investment, like today I choose a profession and I stand by that. No, the entire profession is based on the notion that you're risking your life at every single enterprise you take under, and that there are, say, edgier ways to, like a sort of Russian roulette, right, to accelerate this path in either in a way or another. So there could be, think about the legend of the Black Knight, right, and the notion that there was some sort of more terrifying aspect. It's a deeply theological issue. It is in part connected with the notion, indeed, that there is a divide between sort of the good, the white knight, and the bad, the black one. But as we know pretty well, this is not a Gnostic dualism. It is actually a compenetrating hierarchy, all right? Especially the knights in the lower ranks are, by definition, lower also in moral virtue. Right, they are the Volk pack, right? Whereas, the higher you rise, the more Apollonian and eagle-like you will resplend and be able to command and be able to transfigure your own retinue, and so increasing the quality, really transfiguring your own same followers in that sense. That's also why the principle of command authority was so crucial to this all right? So let's say that there were certain actions that were considered unchivalrous because they mostly revolve around the notion of gratuitous violence without any interest in transfiguration, right? The idea that, for example, you should always forgive your enemy in a way or another. You should give him a chance to rise a better man after a defeat, right? This is a deep Catholic principle, because the notion of killing, that was definitely present. I made multiple videos on, for example, the penitentials. You would think that this word was simply some sort of an anarchic mess, but people did not really care. They cared. I mean, they had a ridiculous coercive capacity. This polities didn't have any of the coercional power that modern states really have. But they actually, like these communities, knights included, were all working as far as determining what kind of proper penitence should follow after bloodshed, after battles. We've seen it before. We talked about Hastings. There was a pretty wide debate regarding, how do we atone for our sins of having killed people? What's the point behind that? First of all, the Bible, most people don't even notice that, it's like... deists that think, that the Cathars were good, pious people that after all should have not been killed in a broader sense, or at least by earthly standards. There is a difference between killing and murdering, all right? This is more or less what we are discussing here. Humanity is fallen, right? So the imperfection in that derives, let's say, that instantiates itself in the incapacity to redeem a person without cutting that life short, and so all the potential that lays in it is at least understood as potentially conducive to a higher learning, right? Also killing, think about this polyaopia, this is a very old tradition, is actually supposed to happen in the in that transfigurational path, especially if you look at the initiatory rites, the war bands at the lower levels. Every once in a while, you could get killed just in the initiation process for how traumatic it was. It was said that routinely, for example, among Celtic warriors, one guy out of the war band was ritually sacrificed every once in a while to show that, of course, these people were zero and that all was the divinity who owned them, right, through the color of the torque, which is something you can find, we discussed also in the tradition of the warrior beast of the berserkers, the Ulfhednars, and so on. This was not ideal because it happened in the fallen kind, right? At the highest level, you should conquer the world without even unsitting your sword, just out of your own divine power, right? That does not need to kill. In this sense, the biblical commandment is fully in line with the millenary Catholic, Christian, pre-Christian tradition that acknowledges the doctrine of the two natures in as much as God can achieve that. Christ conquers the world without killing anyone in the process. But let's say the humankind, the fallen kind, obviously has a difficulty in doing that. So knights were, in theory, supposed, again, by divine standard, not necessarily to kill anyone just for the sake of that, right? Because they were obviously armed and ready. But this obviously reflected their mortal, human dimension. And so the notion was kill, don't murder. Right? If it gets to it's either you or him, even provided that there is always a better way to solve the matter, which is absolutely present there. It's like war today. Think about it. Like, you could think that there is, let's say, it never comes, that there is nothing deterministic in tradition. All right? You can't say that even when things happen, that, as you know, etches them into a metaphysical dimension. This is because it truly had to happen, right? In tradition, we believe that free will and predetermination exist at the same time. But in this sense, there is always in potential a space for settling matters amicably as long as things are properly addressed, right? If this doesn't happen, there must be somebody who is able to will this world, and so to potentially be able to eradicate anyone from the face of the earth. Hopefully that will not have to happen, but there is still, according to chivalric standards, a way to kill, which entails sin in this regard, because you killed a creature that had a spark of divinity within that, and so you killed that, and that's a sin. But you may have actually augmented your own spark through the process, because what you will have learned through that mistake, as we know, is more powerful than simply having gotten to the same place without not having made the mistake at all. And so it may seem also, on thermodynamic basis, something debatable, if it wasn't for the fact that, in fact, tradition does believe that the process of transfiguration is able to create new life, love, and force in this sense through such augmentation, so much that this very spark within each of us can, in theory, expand to overwhelm the entire universe in a truly transfigurational fashion. Jean de Bouille, a 15th century French nobleman and military writer that we have really met quite often in similar videos to this and that, and whose works reflect the martial ethos of his era, viewed notoriously war as unsurprisingly, war as a school of asceticism. Right, it was perfectly understood still in the 15th century by these men-at-arms, and that, of course, warfare entailed some metaphysical clash of spiritual education and moral exercise. It demanded exertion, pain, and labor. According to Bouille, participants endured hardships, perils, poverty, and famines, wearing armor day and night and fasting much of the time. Right? These sacrifices aim to secure honor and renown, to achieve perfect glory in this world, as all worldly honor stems from conquests and warfare. Right? I will stress this, all worldly honor stems from conquests and warfare. So the 12th century mentality about, noblemen should, literal explicit citation, should think nothing of breaking heads and bones, right? It was not particularly over 300 years later. As naturally, the otherworldly gain was something much wider and evidently manifesting in the world as well. Again, if you presume to study history, the Bible or whatever, without knowing what the doctrine of the two natures is, it's just better if you stop doing anything, at least until you have studied that. I made an entire video on the topic. And so I say this because whenever you find any criticism to the idea that war has a purpose, which is instrumental, war per se is just a mean, a tool. It's not good or bad inherently so, but it may, again, as we've seen in the motivation, be the outcome of a failed effort of the greater sin of mankind. There is no doubt about this. But if, in fact, you do not arrive there, if you're not aware of what the two natures are and how they are not separated, they're constantly interplaying with one another, you cannot properly have any depth of judgment on any sort of, for example, strategic analysis, political criticism whatsoever. Most people literally stop war is bad, and if you actually have this idea that, I don't know, that the necessity of universal empire, something negative or whatever, without even starting to explain what that would be, for example, or thinking that either, you realize how limited and hopelessly human people are, right? Regarding the same criticism towards the Cathar history, it did not get much criticism, but if not by these sort of random newcomers that literally do not search for any of my work and pretend to understand it, that's the difference between worthy and unworthy people, right? And it is literally how they thought at the time. It is actually not different today, just we don't conceptualize it, we don't rationalize it. It is literally how the world goes, by metaphysical order, not because somebody has an opinion about it. In any case, it's evident that war stood out as a path of general elevation. For example, the same Buya says, great triumphs and mighty lordships essentially derive from this. Remember what triumphs are, what the mors triumphalis is in the doctrine of sacred royalty. What's the concept of lordship? What's the function? What's the contractual nature of government, right? And what is that you actually get in exchange? Just think of all the people said, oh no, there should not be a government because, I don't know, freedom, whatever. Also, if you don't know what the doctrine of the two natures is, if you think that freedom belongs to humanity, good luck with your theological understanding. It's really difficult, again, to proceed with these limits, but that's also why I'm sort of pointing this out continuously, because you must wake up before trying anything, all right? And there are very specific guidelines to understand what for laziness, ignorance, uneducation, the allegedly sort of greatest thinkers of this era seem to make a huge fuss about, just because they don't actually know anything about. For example, Jordan Peterson does not know anything of this, right? He has a grasp through his own path that there is something like tradition, but he literally doesn't even know about the doctrine of two natures. So the question is, how can you, in fact, certain answers that he gives or that he doesn't give actually literally stand in this realm, right, in this ambiguity. And I must, if anything, I must contact him at some point, because it's not possible to continue like that. Comparing the courtier to the warrior, Jean de Buye unhesitatingly favored the latter, noting that the warrior's life carried only slightly greater risks while offering far more assured virtues. This is a very beautiful idea, right? Naturally, there is a sort of estates criticism in here. Naturally, Jean de Bouille lives in a time that we also documented in multiple videos about medieval French monarchs of the 15th century, in particular, caught in the Third Estate, in the government of this enormous system that France was. So there is some broader political and social criticism. But it's very beautiful to think that actually the riskiest business is somehow still the most rewarding in any case. He evaluates basically the risks to be in particular slightly higher, meaning that in a broader condition of mortality, even if you will have lived, half life more or less, is that really what truly matters, or is it what kind of quality and transfigurational potential you're able to enact rather? All right, this naturally draws straight from the doctrine of self-sacrifice and struggle and victory. Jean de Bouille says arms always reward their devotees, right? This is literally religious, spiritual talk explicitly in de Bouille's words. He explains, in fact, that this happens in three ways, right? Death, through a warrior's death, is as common as any others. Naturally, he reasons in this sense in a bit more of a modern secular fashion, but he is also banalizing earthly death, which is actually the point of it all. You can achieve eternal life, or at least a higher condition, also in the broader cosmic struggle, that can keep basically operating even in the afterlife, in the perennial dimension. A modest but honorable existence. So there are basically some societal standards that spot you as a honest dealer, so to say. Naturally, as we've seen, there are also people who commit crimes in war, etc. But at least here we're talking chivalric ideals and knightly warfare per se. So in its fully, codified higher sense. And again, the notion of the legacy, the fact that others will speak of you, the fact that your life will not be over. This is also what he does not explicitate, but again, it has to do with the aforementioned continuity in time. There are great examples in this era of people that we still remember, even in sort of more banal modern secular terms. Think about Bertrand de Guesclin, the 14th century Breton knight and French military commander famed for his victories in the 100 Years' War. And Gadifer de la Salle, a 14th, 15th century French knight who led the conquest of the Canary Islands, that was seen as, a massive feat, considering that, the age of exploration was yet to fully take off, right? And we're in 1482. The Canaries are far away, like down the coast of Morocco. But just for saying what kind of spaces, like the idea of molding the world in your own image through conquest, just think about what Alexander had done. In a sense, was echoed by this more modest but still impressive expeditions as late as the 15th century. Think about the age of explorations literally as this broader global meaning, not some sort of random accident, right? Nativists will whine because their inferior culture was taken over by a superior one by claiming things like, that Columbus got lost, right? What would you tell them, right? Other than thinking that, after all, it was really good, what unfolded from that. Jean de Bouille also highlights that, of course, earthly goods are fundamentally transient, right? As long as they remain this fallen dimension, they're unimportant by definition. So no one really takes their wealth into the grave. Say you can make some broader case of how you die, which is the big question mark. At least tradition, faith suggests like that. Again, it's exactly the lack of fear that allows you to transcend mortality. Fear is actually the cause of mortality itself. So you may think while reading this is just like a motto, like say a proverb, nobody really takes it well to the grave, everybody's level after that. This is not what like this 15th century French knight actually believed per se, right? It was an invitation to embrace self-sacrifice in holy combat, in the doctrine of struggle and victory. All right. He also said there are more noble poor serving at courts and in great cities than in warfare. Right. And finally, fortune. For true arms, one might become the greatest emperor in the world. Right. This is fully fledged imperial Catholic tradition 101. Like true arms, one might become the greatest emperor in the world. And again, it is not really meant in terms of a random ruler, as people see empires just like that, eliminating the foundational Catholic principle behind any of them, right? If you don't know why empires are there, again, sorry for your historical situation. The focus on personal valor, extraordinary or even solitary feats, and individual triumph may have reinforced the idea that medieval warfare was a series of duels, with the collective aspect of courage overlooked or misconstrued. This is not really the case. Heroic warfare, issuing the enemy single combat, say champions, in fact, clashing against one another in duels, we've seen it again in the video about Archetypal, have a deeper psychomagic point to it. Of course, there is some inner demon to tame and transfigure, so which is the same demon, female demon of victory, the soul of chivalry, the angel-like woman, victory herself, the Holy Ghost. All right. So this entire notion of courage is mostly like the necessity felt by these medieval authors to take that leap forward that was still understood as being crucial in order to Catholically achieve true works, a part of salvation. In theory, it could be full salvation. If you follow Christ's example to the letter, that would be the case. Alongside the glorification of the valiant and the heroic, you have Jacques de Longuyon, for example, 14th century French poet, introducing the 9 worthies, right around 1312 in Le Vœu du Pont, a romance composed for Thibaut de Bar, Prince Bishop of Liège, known for his patronage of literature. And he lists these figures, 3 Jews that are Joshua, David, Judas Maccabeus. We also made a video about Maccabean warfare. If you're interested, we'll come back to that. 3 pre-Christian, Hector, Caesar, and Alexander. Interestingly enough. 3 Christians, Arthur, Charlemagne, and Godfrey of Bouillon. It's fascinating, by the way, that Godfrey, that, as you know, was a baron, was not a king. At least he became eventually king of Jerusalem, but at least in a nominal sense, because he thought that, again, this was the kingdom of heaven, and he as a mortal could not wear the crown that Christ instead deserved. But it's meaningful because he was really a great champion and symbol of individual knightly exploit, an actual sort of very historical one. I mean, Charlemagne, for not talking about Arthur, were, regardless of the historicity degree of the characters, some sort of more mythological figures, some excellences that were quite, the memory which was very alive in so many deeper archetypal meaning. Godfrey of Bouillon was equally so, but it was more relatable because, you know, he was like a very specifically historical and sort of pinpointable figure that had achieved what was thought not to be possibly achieved, right? And by the late 14th century, you have Eustache de Champs, a prolific French poet and courtier known for his ballades and moral writings, cataloging even 9 heroic women. This is fascinating because women, as you know, were not traditionally believed to be capable of achieving, in fact, salvation, if not through, let's say, at the following of their men. And so as the actual victory, the angel-like woman tamed and possessed and transfigured in this greater unity of the couple that we discussed again in Erected the Need. I also made a video about how elite couples were seen in late medieval France, probably through literature. So if you're interested, I will likely post this in the top fix comment down below. Deschamps added a 10th worthy, that was Bertrand de Guesclin, and with less success, a 10th heroine, Joan of Arc, by the way. And again, regardless, of course, these are heroines as far as that symbol of the soul of chivalry were concerned. And naturally were understood differently, however, from men anyway. This is important because it does maintain the awareness on the cruciality of the female medium in order for the male hero to attain salvation itself. And we explained again why. Whether drawn from history or contemporary times, secular or sacred narratives, the Middle Ages also prized the bravery of lineage, race, or people, all bound to show solidarity on the battlefield. This could take on a local, provincial, national, regional, universal, right, international character in many ways. This was the corporate theory, but a traditional world that is oddly forgotten today. Now, it was customary not only to position the finest individual fighters, such as young novice knights recently armed, at the forefront, but also to rely on units renowned for collective valor, such as the Templars or Hospitallers, military monastic orders active during especially the Age of Crusades. For what we're looking at today, of course, the Hospitallers went on. The Templars are in theory surviving in part as well, but they were, as we know, so because we made multiple videos on them, were famously known for their discipline in combat, or rather for the spiritual nature of their knighthood, right? The fact that they were warrior monks. This monarchism actually, as we explained also in other videos, we will come back on it better at some point, because it never made as a sort of full video on this, but was understood as a period of initiation. It's like the Morabites, it's like all those who before entering the world, they went under some higher, let's say, harder testing that had to spiritually prepare the soul as a sort of load in it as a spring, like to eventually overwhelm the enemy in combat. So it's a harsher training, a greater privation, something that really galvanized the spirit in as much as look at what we're able to do to begin with, so that life, death for us is just the ultimate end. It's just what we really want in the perennial dimension. So earthly death does not scare us. We will fight to the death. These were elite knights that, as you know, for example, within the aforementioned Kingdom of Jerusalem, constituted basically the backbone of even the same knightly force. Together with the others, we also made a video about the organization of the Jerusalemitan army during this period. And winning in battle can occur through the same self-sacrifice that will make the knight achieving this higher place. Naturally, we can't debate on how this actually happens, because also death in combat is a problem, right? It's not simply like, okay, just because you died, by accident, maybe in the expedition you're just going to heaven per se. It's really very different, but it has to do with challenging death. And the belief that, again, the deeds of the past, even though you're again dead and in this sense to a degree defeated, would be enough for him to earn a place closer to God, who would thus inherit that part that had fundamentally managed to transfigure among the divine ranks themselves, so that for the end time struggle they would have had this force from their side. This was definitely important because you understand that there wasn't much of an individual motivation or a personal motivation other than the greater effort of all, saving the world, saving the universe, saving the people you love, resurrecting them from the dead, and so continuing to operate in the world by blessing those who in turn deserve your protection. That's why, for example, the tradition of saints that you find in the military banners, this wasn't mere sort of superstition. Of course, some people would have intended in that contractualistic way, but truly this is never avoided in traditional societies from the awareness that there is an actual force in the banners, in the insignia, in the symbols of power, and that these truly reflect, contain, and provide with that God-given power. The aforementioned sense that every people in the world had a rank, right, and so a place in the hierarchy, due also to the different degree by which they had fallen, or better, also the degree by which the ancestors, the participant in the holy struggle, had partially sort of lightened the original sin of this community, reflected in military precedents on the medieval battlefields, right? There were some peoples that were thought to be stronger, that to have acquired some higher reputation, nobility, and more. This is a very interesting concept that is technically known as the primatus pugnae. So the primacy of the privilege of being the first to strike in battle. This is partly reflected through the notion that the first one who breaks spear, the one that is, especially during the 13th century, when in-depth formations unavoidably bring just one, the first battle line to be composed of those who will fight first, like, and so that had at least a privilege in that kind, even though that could also be cynically exploited, which is a very important aspect related to the fact that very often these were the spearheading force, right? Not necessarily the ones, in fact, often not the ones over which, like, the entire army relied on for winning the actual battle. Normally was the middle line of the three in the 13th century that had the greatest force in that sense. But still, this force was considered to be qualitative enough to disrupt the enemy formation in such a way that would sort of, say, softening up, sort of breaking its back. And even though sometimes, like, this first line was actually destined to be butchered, and or at least its participants to literally pass through the enemy ranks, not knowing when to stop and being put down at some point along the way. Having the primatus pugnae was the greatest honor and privilege in all of this. So again, it applied to actual nations. For example, during the imperial wars, the Swabians, the Germanic people, as you know, the descendants from the Alemanni, who, since the Battle of Unstrut in 1075, this was a clash during the investiture controversy, had claimed the same primatus pugnae in a universal sense. As you know, the Swabians will later own the empire themselves, which is interesting, because they were sort of underdogs, initially speaking. They had been subjected by the Franks, etc. If you think the Habsburgs, many, like later also the Hohenzollern, etc., were of Swabian origin. Some of the Habsburgs also actually of Burgundian blood for that matter, but there is even in the Was ist das deutsches Vaterland, for example, famous nationalistic song, still in the 19th century, the recognition that even though there was nobody really notable in Swabia at the time, the big players were the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollern, that had migrated to Austria and Prussia, but still of Swabian blood, the first land associated with German glory still remained, historically, obviously, Swabia. There is the myth of the Hohenstaufen, made lots of videos about Frederick II, Frederick I. We'll have to come back on them. And so there was the sense that this was a particularly pugnacious people. Also, this would be interesting to analyze from a broader, say, cultural, international point of view, because, of course, there were other peoples that at some point were also more performing. But still, why did Swabia rise at that point? And it's very important to discuss. I have a playlist on medieval Swabia. If you're interested in that, we will surely replenish it soon. All right. You also know that from battles like, here we look at the Battle of the River Unstrut, but if you look at the Battle of Civitate, that was just a few decades before you have the Swabians. They are actually losing, but standing their ground as footmen with 1.5 hand swords against the Norman cavalry charges in the papal army. That's quite a big showdown then during the various Raumfahrt, the various Italian expeditions. You know how the Swabians distinguished themselves on multiple occasions. There is the Battle of Tusculum. There is really a lot of different circumstances where they challenged the same Romans, right? And actually, they would call themselves Roman, as far as especially the Ottonian legacy had fully officialized that whoever held the empire owned also the metaphysical ethnicity of the Romans, right? Even though they were Germans. And in fact, the German battle cry by the 13th century was "Here's Rome, here Rome," and so it's impressive, really, and it ties all with the aforementioned imperial hierarchy of peoples, right? We should recover this rigid discrimination of higher and lower cultures in the history of mankind, because this is literally what these people lived by. In orations delivered by kings and military leaders before significant battles, collective victories of the entire army or people, not individual exploit, were cited as harbingers of future success. In the Débat des héros d'armes, the two adversaries strive to demonstrate the overall valor of English and French, of the English and French, respectively. So that was naturally some proto, I would say nationalistic, because actually the concept of nation, of natio in a Latin sense, was already there. And so here it's obvious. Just considered, I created myself back in from years a playlist that is called Comparison Between Medieval France and English, because of the intertwinement of their deep intertwinement of their history, that in a sense is so much like sort of the perfect strategic board game. The red and the blues, more or less the same guys. Again, there are so many archetypal ideas and connections. There is this broader Germanic, or in some cases even Celtic background to that. There is this mingling, for example, of these lands, France, Flanders, England, historically, also the Celtic French with Brittany, Wales, etc., with this broader mix of Celto-Germanic epos. These are the most feudal countries out there, the ones that set a bit the standards of chivalry themselves. So I'm actually expanding my content in military history specifically in that direction, because it feels like so much necessary to educate, to disclose medieval warfare through those examples. There is really plenty of stuff that we can provide. Besides, if you're interested in this national comparisons, there is also a video made about the 12th century Holy Roman Empire that deals with the international debate of why did the Germans monopolize, the imperial title, say from French or English sources. It's fascinating because, as you know, the English mostly played along with the Germans in an anti-French fashion, but there were some thinkers in the same England said, why should we actually recognize that it was done at some point by Henry II, and, it was, shared blood with the wealth, and etc. This imperial title, where also from a French side, for example, France came to be even more important than Germany in an imperially unitary direction, so to say. So these are debates that to some extent are eventually lost to history and or lead mostly to not a national but in a nationalistical competition between the various European states historically. That is also tradition, say, containing part of traditional notions. There is no doubt about it. In any case, there are so many other topics connected with this one. For example, temporary bonds of solidarity could form, rooted in oaths, vows, or even physical ties, ropes, chains. See, for example, what happened to the King John of Bohemia, that despite blindness fought and died at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. His son Charles, these are very famous figures in, of course, the 14th century, made multiple videos on them. The Luxembourg House, symbolizing a great deal of chivalric loyalty, but also still, for example, royal errand kind of lifestyle, right? So this notion that even a king would at some point want to fight and die as a blind man on one of the greatest battles of the era. That's the honor, the sense. We talked very much about the necessity of these fighters is to die in the best possible way, as we pointed out before, the fact that the biggest battle was the greatest showdown where you could test. There was almost an economical principle of morality behind that. This was the place where transfiguration was more likely to occur, where the stakes were the highest, so you could sort of come closer to the possibility of earning your place in heaven. All right. Then there are other forms of communal and blood ties. For example, the communal spirit led the Swiss military code to allow anyone to strike down a nearby comrade who fled or caused panic, rather than reserving punishment for authorities. Among the Swiss, that developed mostly like a cantonal feeling, etc. We talked about Swiss warfare. We have, if anything, to come back on Swiss history at some point. Having less of a feudal, there were knights among them, to tell the truth, but say having less of a feudal hierarchy felt more this sort of almost civic need to deliver justice. Like a man that in the aforementioned feudal context would flee the field would be indicated as a coward by everybody. He would be lost, would be really... he couldn't erase that episode. The great noblemen were known by everyone across all the various estates and by also abroad. So remember, the big battle is the moment in which everybody also measures the value of others. It's a big show, but also a big test, and that's why it's so attractive, so entertaining. There are sort of all different, again, we could make plenty of examples of how this value was deserved. For example, there was something similar to modern military decorations in the Middle Ages. This is perhaps not much forgotten, but something that is often not pictured other in that case, compared from, say, other than talking about symbolical aspects. But some of this power was concrete. For example, 25 florins were awarded to the first Italian soldier to scale besieged cities' walls. Or silver helmets were granted to condottieri alongside their baton of command. The latter, by the way, very famous symbols of power, right? The club is one of the first weapons of war, which so much is associated in that initiatory and commanding forces of the condottieri, and their might would definitely mirror that. But even money was actually connected to it, because florins were golden. Here we see silver helmets. So these were the material of God. The golden age, the silver age, the bronze, the iron one. So being awarded with this was not just how much you could economically spend this stuff, but that precious metal meant something about what you could gather from the universe because of your own courage and your own valor. This is very interesting. In 14th century Florence, that we also made videos on somehow recently, and given also the prosperous essence of this Italian city-state, was literally the richest city in the entire globe, right? And that for this reason would also start hiring some, at least, mercenary armies. The thing is relatively controversially complicated, but think about John Hawkwood, etc. Victorious units received a collective double monthly pay, right? This is obvious. It's also how, think about the Doppelsöldner later on. If you risk your life, of course, the more you risk your life, the more you were rewarded. That's why, I don't know, we've seen it also in the Battle of Tagliacozzo, the Battle of Montaperti, just to remain in Tuscany with Florence and Siena. The German mercenaries sent by King Manfred of Sicily to the Ghibelline Sienese, that were a bit like the aforementioned spearhead of the army, the more hot, especially the Germans, had this sort of furious charge, like the Furor Teutonicus is definitely highlighted in the sources, and not just as a classical echo. Their charges were something else. The French were sort of more disciplined, but the Germans were really hotheads. Once unleashed, they were simple people, really. You told them what to raise to the ground, and they they did so. And those were paid more, just as, of course, very heavy knights, and there were people also, of course, of nobility or aristocratic background, mostly, right? Aside from, again, we explained how in the 13th century retinues had reached also a bit the same technical level of their masters, whatever. This is not so important, but these were paid more because simply they were the spearhead of the army, right? And so you can argue that, in essence, the spirit of camaraderie was employed as frequently as individual rivalry and competition to enhance a soldier's conduct. Recently made a video about the Italian communal army, and we observed how, for example, the carroccio was a bit like the symbol of the people rather than the symbol of the city. The knights themselves, however, rose over the carroccio to give instruction to all the units, because at the end of the day, it was about fighting against a common enemy, but also proving that, I don't know, maybe the peditas were as competitive as the militas, especially in Italy, where infantry was so strong. And so there is all a sense of compenetration of values, of symbolism, etc., that, however, always underscore a traditional background that these peoples commonly shared and believed. I don't know how, I've admittedly come to appreciate very much these sort of spiritual background, because in my opinion, it really explains everything. Right, you can look at all these examples, all pointing to the same direction. This, at the same time, I really never found explained, as I do in my videos, as a historian and as also sort of amateur history of religion as well. That, in my opinion, again, is to make really a great sense, and that cannot be done without. Because otherwise, how do you glue this together? Like, how do you explain combat psychology? How do you explain political motivation? How do you really look at the essential of why people went to fight and die, right? I think it's pretty obvious and somehow necessary to appreciate, if anything, to measure what we're talking about. Because if you understand that there is a universal meaning to this, and that the background itself is the measure also of the specific instantiation of how this belief was declined, you can see how this is a path of interpretation to the entire system that is able to explain all the differences within the same, not by flattening, but by exalting them. So finally not describing them because they're different, but describing them because their difference makes sense as a whole. And this gives you a roadmap to the universe that is truly divine in its extreme. So I honestly find these topics very, very stimulating. I think that there is an abundance of room, let's say, for further content of this kind, and we're definitely going on the right tracks. I think we're traveling to the right direction. We're really functioning as we're supposed to, and I think the channel benefits of that. Right? There are some videos that are more like you have to do them, right? And this one, for example, like it's not. I was praying to arrive to the day I was making them, because it's also admittedly a matter of when you do them and what kind of meaning they acquire as such. But it has a lot to do with devil, the whole concept, and also the way you can add information, let's say title after title, in an organic way. And so I hope that this is mostly what you're realizing that I'm doing here, right? It may seem, again, relatively strange for me to make all these videos, and who sees what I'm doing probably at a first glimpse does not quite grasp why or how this topic is fully intertwined. All right. But at the same time, that's exactly the point. At some point, you enter a Schwerpunkt and you come to learn about certain things you didn't even know they were meaningful. And the greatest struggle, the greatest challenge sort of is to make people understand that certain topics are necessary to understand the world. Right? If you watch, for example, so much, I don't know, as it happened, the video on the Cathars, but you don't watch like the video on the institution of the Jubilee and the pilgrimage to the 7 churches of Rome, you're not in a good place. All right? You're not really making a favor to yourself. Right? The top 90 YouTube history channel made it's just such a junky video, let's be honest, unlike basically anything I've ever done, and yet it got more views. Why don't you watch, I don't know here what I have done, like even just the last videos, that at large they have a meaning, right? They have a meaning that goes beyond what most people assume this whole thing is about. And that's what I'm basically showing you also day after day. Some wrote me, you feel tired. I don't feel tired of making videos. I'm feeling tired, if anything, of seeing this pattern. Obviously due to the fact that, again, you can't watch everything, etc. But the topic choice is for viewing is very often sort of weird, and it does not render justice to the entire topic, whatever you can squeeze out of these videos. And again, it's actually a lot. I see here the images that I used. Yeah, they're somehow proud of the video, of the images I use, because they are quite evocative and they're really about the same things we're discussing, so they should really wake people up. This little videos, I don't know how much watch, etc., but they really help stiffening the ranks, stiffening properly the algorithm, the visibility of the channel, so I don't complain. Let's just go along the way with a straight back and knowing exactly what we have to do, right? Then spikes will occur. There are some videos that do better, others that do worse. We're not scared. We're not scared overall. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.